Hi, I'm Len McDonald, and this is episode 5 of the Week 45 podcast. After spending several months back in the East Coast, Pete, you decided that you were going to make a pretty significant move back to the West Coast.
That's right. I came back. I had a great winter there. It was really amazing, eye-opening kind of thing. And I was like, I'm going to pack up some actual items in the car and try to make a go of this and actually see if I can spend a year there and just see how that goes. So it was an incremental process. It went from going from 3 weeks one winter to 4 months on my last trip, and finally saying, okay, I'm going to fill my car up and actually go out there and make a year of it.
And when you say fill your car up, that is literal. I remember you were in Halifax at the time. It was October 30th when we were leaving. I recall when I looked at the car and I wondered where I was going to sit because the car was so jammed full and there was a clamshell on the roof. And as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, did I not have one of your drums like between my knees on the passenger side, or am I dreaming?
That sounds right. I think it was something like that. It must not have been that uncomfortable, but you had something down on the floor. So it was right at its limit. And I will say, after years of playing shows on the road, being in a van with a bunch of guys doing the bar band thing around the Maritimes and beyond, you become an expert in the Tetris game of packing a van with gear and fitting everything in just in the right spot and basically having no daylight left. In this case, that came in really handy because I could visualize it. I was like Rain Man. I could see where all the pieces fit, and much to Dad's amusement.
My first shock was when we get out on the road, and of course you have a heavy load, and it was a small vehicle. I was watching the fuel gauge, and I could just literally watch the needle moving, like with every kilometer. The combination of a full car, and I remember that morning it was windy. There had been a storm the night before, and I'm thinking, oh my God, like it's going to cost us $1 million to get to Victoria with.
Yeah, we couldn't get down to those U.S. gas prices soon enough. You know?
Yes. So we decided on this trip to kind of take our time. We were going to drive down the eastern seaboard. I don't think, Pete, you'd seen sort of that whole part of the eastern United States, and to go down to our timeshare down in North Redington Beach, Florida, hang out there for a week in the sun, and then continue on our trip across and back up to Victoria.
Yeah, that sounded like a great plan to me. Start with some sun, head back up, and of course, like Dad was saying, the whole I-95 all the way down there was something that was really fascinating to me for some reason, just because New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., all these places really were iconic places in my mind from a variety of TV shows and movies and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I was really keen to drive through and see it with my own eyes.
Rock me, mama, like a wagon wheel. Rock me, mama, any way you feel. Hey, hey, mama, rock me.
But first, we had to cross the border. I made these notes the day after our border crossing, and I'm going to turn it over to Peter to describe what happens. But it was a Friday night. Normally, the border crossing would be extremely busy, but I wrote this down the next day. There's only one thing worse than getting stuck in a long lineup at a U.S. border crossing on a Friday night, and that's getting stuck in a lineup of one, you and the Border Patrol officer. When we went across the border, we were the only vehicle, and I thought, oh my God, we're so lucky. Like we're going to be through there in like probably under a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Not
the case.
Not the case.
In fact, it was quite the opposite. As it turns out, when you're a border guard, you have all the time in the world to pull that one car aside and just see what's going on, you know? And so he pulled us over and saw the state of my car.
I want to interrupt, Pete.
Yeah.
those of you of a certain age remember the Beverly Hillbillies, and in the opening of the television series, there's a picture of Jed and Granny and Jethro and whoever driving into Beverly Hills with their truck like loaded down, and that's kind of what we look like with your rig just so jammed full.
Yeah, they had a few questions.
So I call him the Maytag repairman because like he's just so bored out of his skull, and he pulls us in and we go inside, and all I'm thinking is, oh my God, if he decides to tear Peter's car apart, like we're going to be here for a long time.
So I remember when he pulled us over, he asked the simple question, where are you going? Followed by, and what are you going to do there? To which I answered, I'm going to Victoria, BC, and I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm going to figure it out when I get there. And that, as it turns out, was the wrong answer, and why we were pulled in to sit in this room and made wait while they decided our fate.
Yes, I mean, I'm there thinking, like, what does this guy think that this dad and his son are going to Nashville and we're going to make it big? Like, come on, buddy. We're going through the States. We're going to spend money in your country, and we're going to go to Victoria. Like, come on, give us a break. And by the way, when we get inside, I asked the customs official if I could go and pee. I'm a 60-something-year-old man, and I needed to pee, and he steadfastly refused to let me go. And I couldn't figure that out until sometime later when we kind of rehashed the whole thing. Mm-hmm. No pun intended, but rehashed. But maybe he thought that, Len McDonald was a drug mule and that I was going into the bathroom to unload some cocaine or hash. But I think that's why he wouldn't let me go.
As it turns out, yeah, at the time it was just a total mystery to us. We're like, come on, man. Like, you can tell by the way we're talking, we're not two guys who have any clue about how to move a large quantity of drugs down into the States. But anyway.
So, Pete, how did you convince them that that we weren't drug mules and we weren't going to Nashville to make our fortune?
It became apparent to me pretty quickly that I had to get my story straight and have some proof to back it up. So I did have a reason to go out there, and I was going to be playing with a band, the Jesse Roper Band. I had already played a few shows, and I was scheduled to play another few with them. So I ended up going on Facebook on my phone and showing them photos of me playing with this band on a stage and showing the upcoming dates, showing some correspondence, that kind of stuff. And finally, after about 20 minutes of him going through and scratching his head and looking through the photos and looking at me and looking back at my phone, he finally decided to let us go without tearing the car apart and spreading everything all over their parking lot and doing the full 9 yards. At that point, I was just overjoyed because it had taken so long to pack that thing that would have been a several-hour thing just to get everything back in its place. And I was just thinking, oh, man, like we're going to get set back a whole half day here.
And there's sort of a funny ending to that story as well, Pete, when you were unpacking your car when you got to Victoria.
Yeah. So when I got back to Victoria, Dad stuck around for a week or so and then flew back. I was driving down the street somewhere in Victoria, and I had a CD holder above my visor on the driver's side, and I flipped it down to grab a CD, and onto my lap fell a tinfoil ball filled with weed that I'd forgot about. It was probably 2 years old. I hadn't looked there or thought about that in forever. And it fell onto my lap. And I remember being at a stoplight and looking at it and instantly thinking, oh my God, that road trip could have turned out way differently.
We might still be in a jail in Calais, Maine.
No doubt. So a little piece of luck that that happened at that juncture.
Sometimes the gods are with you.
Rock me, mama, like the wind and the rain. Rock me, mama, like a southbound train. Hey, hey, mama, rock me.
The following day, we got back on the road, and of course, our destination is Florida. We're going down for some sun. And again, as Pete said earlier, he was interested in seeing the east coast of the United States. And so we went through Portland and down through Hartford and down through New York. And we drove through New York, specifically through the Bronx. I have my own little story of the Bronx. Many, many, many years ago, I traveled with a group of golfers. We were going down to, I think it was down to Myrtle Beach, and we took a wrong exit and ended up driving through the Bronx. I remember it was one of those times where I felt very uneasy. As I recall, there was a few of the boys were having a few pops along the way, as you would on a road trip, right? And getting into the Bronx and burnt out cars and old refrigerators and washing machines and broken TVs and just a lot of garbage and litter. And it just, and I was concerned because a couple of the guys in the van were, they were wanting to be brave and stuff like that. And I can just remember everybody turning to them, telling them to politely keep their mouth shut.
Yeah. A prudent move.
A prudent move, yes. Anyway, I think you have your own New York story, Pete.
Yeah, so I was in New York City once for a day. It was on a band trip. We were playing a show just outside of the city, and we decided to go in, just me and the drummer and the band. And I remember we had a couple goals that day, and one of them was to go and see the cafe where Seinfeld was filmed. It was an iconic exterior shot that was prominent in that TV show, and I was a real big fan, and I just wanted to see it. So I remember we went through Times Square. That was an eye-opener in itself, and we ended up getting a subway all the way across up to the other corner of Central Park, up into basically the Upper East Side into Harlem. And we had dinner at the restaurant and we left, and I decided instead of taking the same subway back, we were going to walk a few blocks in the same direction just to get a bit more of a feel for the city and see what was around. So we started walking, and New York is all one big grid, so you figure it's pretty easy to navigate. So we walked south back down towards downtown Manhattan, and we were about 10 blocks into the walk, and we took a left-hand turn to get back to the street where the subway line was on. And I remember suddenly feeling like we weren't in Kansas anymore, and we had wandered into Spanish Harlem. We were two white guys in leather jackets, bopping along, having a good old time, and all of a sudden we're in this neighborhood where there's, again, all these guys hanging out on these stoops, and there's old air conditioners running, and these old kind of classic cars and stuff, and just some characters that you sort of went, I'm not so sure we should be here right now. And my buddy had lived in some places in South America, and he was confident. He's like, oh, this is nothing, man. This is nothing. Don't worry about that. And I'm like, I'm not so sure, man. Like I feel like we could disappear and never be found again. So I remember we walked by this one group of guys, probably 8 guys, and they were all sitting on this stoop. And one of them jumped out in front of me and sneezed, like intentionally, to try to rattle me. And it did. I nearly jumped out of my shoes, and they all started laughing. And I grabbed Eddie by the shoulder, and I'm like, we're getting a cab. We're hopping in right now. So anyway, it's a good thing that we did get a taxi, because that day there were bomb threats on the subway, and they actually shut down the entire New York subway system that day. So we got back down to Times Square, and everything was police lined off, caution tape everywhere, and the whole city was essentially at a standstill. So that few hours was just like, is this every day in New York? Is this what you expect? Quite a city.
If you travel enough, you're going to take some wrong turns, like literally and figuratively, and you're going to end up in some places where you perhaps should not have been. And I often look back in my travels over the years, and it didn't happen a lot, but I can remember certainly a handful of times that it happened. You kind of afterwards, you kind of laugh it off, and it makes a great story. But boy, sometimes you got to be a bit lucky too, because you never know. You never know what can happen.
For sure. And that was one of those times. I happened to come across a bunch of guys who were just joking around and trying to get a rise out of their buddies by scaring a couple guys who obviously were a long way from home. But just as easily, you could have walked down the next street and ran across someone
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't so funny.
And of course, this is not just, inner city United States. It could happen in Halifax or Montreal or literally anywhere.
Oh, for sure.
If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
For sure.
You know? Now, luckily, those of us who travel in Canada, we kind of know our way around these places, and you know in advance. There's some places you just don't want to be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's going through New York. It's interesting. My one thing that I would like to do before my traveling days come to an end, I've really not spent any time in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to go and see a Broadway play and just see the sights and the sounds, because apparently it's it's the city that never sleeps, right?
It's incredible. It really is. I remember walking down to Canal Street and buying a fake Rolex from some guy who opened up his jacket. I remember going up to the top of the Empire State Building and, doing all this stuff. It's an incredible city for all the reasons that you think it would be. I mean, you've got something you like, it's going to be there. You're going to find it in New York City.
Start spreading the news. I'm leaving today. I want to be a part of it. New York, New York.
On October 31st, 2015, we traveled further down the line. After we left New York, we went through Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C. I know, Pete, that you were kind of interested in checking out some of the sights and sounds, but we got there, we were in Washington like at 7 o'clock in the evening, and I didn't think it was sort of prime being a tourist type of thing, but you wanted to drive in and go by and see the White House and state Capitol and the Washington Monument and stuff. And I do recall that you were a little maybe annoyed that we didn't take the opportunity, but I think if you're going to go see Washington, I mean, I really think that's somewhere where you need to go and spend, days, not.
Yeah, it wasn't the right time on that trip. I think we saw from a distance the Capitol and a couple places like that. But just for me, I just like to get an idea of the geography of places and sort of like put an actual three-dimensional image in my mind of like how these places are, because the way you see them represented on TV and movies gives you this idea, and then you get there and it's different. And that kind of difference fascinates me. I like to really know.
As it turns out, I mean, this was a long day. We put on 1,300 kilometers that day. That's a big day. And when we got to Washington, we still had a couple of hours left where we wanted to, make some time. So we went through Washington and Richmond, Virginia, and we ended up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, 11 o'clock that night. So you got a fairly good feel of the Eastern Seaboard driving through some of these places.
Yeah, I would say for sure. Going through Boston, going through New York, going through Washington, D.C., it's just nonstop, city after city after city. There's really no rural areas in between all of those. Once you hit Boston, essentially, it feels like you're just kind of fading in and out of cities. You're never really in the woods anymore until somewhere down in Virginia or North Carolina or something like that.
Exactly. We left Rocky Mount on November 1st and continued on south and down into Florida. And one of the places I can distinctly remember, we stopped in Gainesville. I don't know why. I can still see, we were in a big parking lot, and I think we were fairly near the university or something. But Pete, you have a story about Gainesville?
Well, yeah, it's not really a story as much as it's, I just know that the Gators play there, the university football team, and they have an enormous stadium. And I was constantly amazed when we drove through these cities, when you caught a glimpse of these university stadiums, and they were 10 times as big as the major sporting stadiums in Canada. And you're just like, honest to God, 100,000 people show up for these events. It's just mind-boggling. Yeah. And then the other thing about Gainesville, of course, I'm a huge Tom Petty fan, and that's where he grew up. And reading his biography and knowing a little bit about that place, it was kind of neat to go through, again, put a place to the name. And I found Gainesville to be very flat and very swampy. You know, I didn't have this clear image of what Florida was all about, but to me it was beaches and palm trees and more or less tropical. But when you get into the interior parts of Florida, it's very flat. It's very boring. It's very swampy. And that was a bit of an eye opener for me because it was just a part of Florida that I hadn't really thought about or seen before. So, and that makes me think also of the change of geography as you drive down the eastern seaboard. That was another big thing that I was interested to see. Like if you do that in a fairly short period of time, you can really see it changing from the fall season into sort of a spring and then into a summer, and you're going through the Georgia pines, and then you're down and you start seeing your first palm tree, and then all of a sudden within the space of 3 days, you've gone into a completely different climate. So it's really amazing to see that if you do it in that short period of time.
Travel is a wonderful thing. Snowbirds flock to Florida and Arizona and lots of places like that. And it's part of it's the journey, is the road trip. And I think most people that I know, they motor down there, and a lot of them follow that sort of the route that we went on. And it just gives you a visual picture of that part of the country. So we left Gainesville, and then we continued on down south and then to the west, drove through the outskirts of Tampa and made our way over to the Gulf Coast, to North Reddington Beach. Lots of you out there who have spent part of the winter know exactly where that is on the Gulf Coast. You've got St. Pete's Beach to the south, and you've got Clearwater to the north. And to arrive down there, I mean, when we left, I remember the night before we left, there was a terrific lightning and wind and rainstorm in Halifax. And then all of a sudden, you're cruising into North Reddington Beach, and the Gulf of Mexico is right there, and the sun setting. It's a nice spot.
It's a really nice spot.
You can see why a lot of people want to go there, you know?
Yeah, endless white sand beach, beautiful sunsets, warm weather year round. I mean, it really is a nice place.
So that wraps up episode 5 of our podcast, our travels along the eastern seaboard down to Florida. Hope you've enjoyed the ride. Episode 6 coming up next week. We'll be heading north and then west with our destination Victoria. And Pete, there's a lot of interesting stops along the way after we left Florida.
Yeah, there sure is. And on this particular route, whereas the first one we took the I-10 right across the bottom of the United States, this one we decided to kind of veer up and do a slightly more northerly route, still in the southern states, but just a different kind of path. And some of the places we crossed through, I'll remember them for the rest of my life. These are some really incredible visual places and some pretty neat events that happen along the way. So lots to come.
As Tom Cochrane would say, life is a highway. I want to drive it all night long. Thanks, folks. Talk to you next week.